Has anyone ever left your worship team before? Like they just straight up quit. That kind of stinks, doesn't it? And it leaves you feeling like, why? Like, what did I do? Well, in this video, we're going to be talking about 5 reasons that people might leave your worship team. Coming up. Hey, Spencer here from leadingworshipwell.com, your daily dose of practical worship leading tips. If you want to find those tips, head over to Instagram or Facebook at Leading Worship Well, where I'm posting new worship leading tips every single day. But you're here on YouTube, so go ahead, hit subscribe down below, and let's get into it, because today we're talking about worship teams. And specifically, if you are a worship team leader, why people might leave your worship team. Have you ever had somebody leave your worship team before? And maybe they just came up to you and they said, hey, I just feel like I can't lead worship anymore. I need some time off. Or maybe it was a little bit more straightforward than that, and there was a problem in your worship team and they brought it up and they said, I don't like this, and they left. Like, it always stinks when that happens, right? It stinks to see that somebody left your worship team. And so I want to share with you today these 5 reasons that you might not be thinking about that people leave your worship team. And when people leave your worship team, sometimes they try to be nice and they don't actually tell you the real reason that they're leaving your worship team. Well, in this video, I want to tell you some of those real reasons, and it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but I want you to think back to when somebody has left your worship team in the past, and I want you to think, is that what happened whenever I share these 5 things? Before we get into those, though, I want to hear from you. What's one reason that somebody might leave a worship team? Maybe it's something that you've experienced in the past. Maybe you were the one leaving a worship team. Maybe you heard it from somebody else. Just let us know. Warn these other worship leaders why people might leave a worship team, so that we can be on the lookout and we can do things right so people don't leave our worship teams. Let us know in the comments below. What's one reason someone might leave your worship team? I'll talk to you in a second. Thanks so much for leaving a comment down below. Make sure you read those comments, because you might find some more reasons that people might leave your worship team. But let's get into these 5 reasons why people might be leaving your worship team. Reason number 1 has to do with expectations. And most people would think, hey, I've set the expectations too high, and that's why people are leaving. And that might be true, but maybe you have unrealistic expectations. But I want you to think about this. I want you to think about, maybe you set the expectations too low. I talk about that in this video right here, why it's okay and actually encouraged to have high expectations for your worship team members. But maybe one of the reasons that people have left your worship team is because the expectations were actually too low. And why would that cause them to leave? Well, what happens is your expectations show people what you think is important, or it tells them how important you think their job is. So if you set the expectations too low, what you're communicating to them is, hey, like, I don't value the position that you're in. But if you set the expectations high, then you tell them that your position is valuable, and because it's valuable, I'm holding you to these expectations. So if you don't have high expectations for your team and people are leaving all the time, consider not lowering your expectations. Maybe your expectations are too low and you need to raise them, and you need to raise up that position on your worship team so that people start taking it seriously. Also, on top of that, if you have high expectations, when people join your worship team and you put those out before them and say, these are the expectations that we're holding you to. You need to memorize your music. You need to come to rehearsal on time. You need to whatever you want the expectations to be on your worship team, and they are big expectations, that shows the person who is coming into your worship team that, hey, we take this seriously. And if you're not going to take it seriously, then you can't be on the worship team. And that's okay to say, because worship leading is a big responsibility. Like, we want people on our worship team who are going to take it seriously, because that's a serious responsibility in the church. And so when you set these low expectations, you get what I call low capacity volunteers. And that's not like a judgment on the volunteers' character as a person. I'm just saying, the lower the expectations are, the lower capacity volunteers will join in, who aren't like committed to the cause. Because if you're like, you don't have to come to worship rehearsal every week. If you come once a month, you can still lead on Sunday. Like those are the kind of people that you're going to be drawing to your worship team. And by the way, that's going to make everybody else on your worship team angry, and they might leave as well because they see this person only coming to rehearsal once a month and they're coming every week. So that's a side note though. So set the expectations high. When you set the expectations high, it shows that the position that somebody holds on the worship team is valuable. If people are leaving your worship team, maybe you've set the expectations too low. Reason number 2 that people might be leaving your worship team is that you haven't stuck to the expectations that you've set. So maybe you have set some expectations and you've set them high, but you aren't sticking to them. And that's sort of the same as having low expectations. If you're going to set expectations and not stick to them, then you might as well not have expectations at all, because they don't really mean anything. And so what you might see in your worship team is not the people who aren't meeting the expectations not coming, but just like I talked about in the last point, the other people on your worship team might be frustrated that if you've got a worship team of 10 people and 4 people are constantly showing up late to rehearsal and they're unprepared, like those people, or even if it's just one person and you don't address it, those people waste the other people's time who have been prepared and who have shown up on time. If you wait for that person who shows up 20 minutes late to rehearsal every time, you're wasting 20 minutes of everybody else on your team time. And over time, that's going to build up and that's going to be a frustration for them. So encourage the people who are sticking to the expectations that you've set. And then the people who aren't sticking to the expectations that you've set, if you've set them high, hold them accountable to them. Because if you don't, then the culture of your team is going to drop, because people aren't sticking to expectations. That's why you have them there in the first place. And eventually that's going to lead to an unhealthy team. So keep that in mind. Set your expectations high, then actually hold people to those expectations, or else the people who are following those expectations might leave because they're like, this isn't working out and these people are wasting my time. So keep that in mind. Hold people to the expectations that you've set. Number 3, let's give people some grace. And not talk about expectations for a second, but just talk about the fact that, hey, maybe they got busy. Maybe people are just legitimately busy in their life. Life changes. Maybe they got a new job. Maybe they had a baby and they need some time off. Maybe there's something else going on in their life and they're just busy. And obviously, we want people who are committed to the worship team, but sometimes things happen in life where it's more important than them leading worship in the church. Like if they have a child and they need to be home with their wife and kids, or their husband and their kids, whatever it is, like show a little grace. And maybe these people, they step away and you can say, and they just say, hey, I'm busy, like I've got this going on. Show them some grace. Don't be like, no, you need to be more committed to the worship team, but just show them some grace and say, hey, we'd love to have you back whenever your schedule frees up and you're able to do this again. And then check back in with them. Even once somebody leaves your worship team, I think you can still reach out to them. Like if somebody leaves your worship team and then you never talk to them again, what does that communicate about their relationship on your worship team? It just shows that you really only cared about them because they were leading worship with you. That doesn't show that you cared about them because they were a member in your church. So continue to reach out to them. Let them know that you're praying for them in their busyness. And then once you sense that busyness is starting to die down through conversations that you've had with them, invite them back to the team. Worship team membership, or whatever you want to call it, can be flexible. Like it doesn't need to be like, hey, you need to commit for the next 5 years of your life. It can be like, okay, like you're able to do it in this season. That's awesome. You do it well. Now you're busy with family stuff or a new job or whatever. Take a step back for a season, get some rest, and we'll do it again in the future. So maybe people are just legitimately busy, and maybe that's why they leave your worship team. Number 4 is that you didn't ever allow them to take a break. And this is kind of a big thing in smaller churches where you don't have people to fill the position if somebody else wants to take a week off. Like maybe you have one guitar player, you have 1 or 2 singers, you've got a drummer and a bass player, and you're like, that's it. you guys need to be here every single week to lead worship because we don't have anybody else. And so you never give them a break, and then they burn out. And it's like, what did you think was going to happen? Because I talk about it all the time. I talk about rest, how you need to rest as a worship leader, but you also need to make sure that your worship team gets a break as well. Like, I recommend at least one Sunday off a quarter if you're in a small church, probably one Sunday off a month if you're in a bigger church and you have people that can fill in for different spots, like different instruments. So just think about that. Are you giving your worship team a break? At least 4 Sundays out of the year, they should have off. And what you can tell them is like, you're important, but you're not that important that you need to be here every single Sunday. You're so important that you shouldn't be here every single Sunday because you need to rest or else you're going to burn out. And most people won't make that judgment call for themselves. So you need to sort of guide them in that decision process. If you want some evidence that most people won't make that decision themselves to take a Sunday off, look at yourself. You probably don't like to take a Sunday off because you're like, I need to be here because the team needs me. Other people feel that way too. So recognize the importance of rest, the biblical importance of rest, and then give that to your team and set it up and say, hey, whoever, I noticed that you haven't taken a Sunday off in 4 months. I think you should take a Sunday off just to rest. And just give them that option. And I think most people will take it if you provide it to them, but we never talk about it as worship leaders. We just always schedule people to serve every single Sunday, right? So give them a break, because if you don't give them a break, then they might burn out eventually and then leave your team. Finally, the 5th reason that people leave your team is that they feel like an employee and not a team member. They might feel like they're working for you, and they have no input in the team. When you're a part of a team, like, you can speak into what's happening in the team. When you're an employee, you just listen to the boss and do whatever they say, right? They don't really care about what you say. But when you're a team member, you are part of something bigger than yourselves. You aren't just there to fulfill a specific duty and then go home. Like, you have buy-in to the team. So ask yourself, have I treated my worship team members like employees, or have I treated them like team members? So don't just have them involved in like, okay, here's your bass part and that's it. Like, show up, I want you to play through, I want you to play the bass line, or I want you to play the drum beat, and that's it. Like, think of ways that you can incorporate people on a deeper level into what's happening in your worship team. So that could be through like having them help with the planning process, giving them additional responsibilities, and not just like menial tasks, but giving them actual responsibilities. Like, maybe they're tasked with training up other leaders in your church so you don't have to do it all by yourself. Like, tell your bass player to, hey, go find somebody else who can play bass and teach them how to play bass. And then that's a way to grow your worship team. Also, you can like have relational moments. Employees don't, sometimes they get together outside of work, but they just show up for their job and then they go home. Don't make that your worship team. Like, don't make it, hey, we're just going to come together and play music and that's it, and never talk to each other outside of church. Like, plan some things that make it feel like a team, like a family, like there's relationships beyond just a working relationship, because that's how it should be in the church anyways. But especially on a worship team, you don't just want them to feel like they're just a musician in the church. You want them to be a worship team member. So treat your worship team like team members instead of employees. If you don't, they might leave. That was a lot about worship teams. And if you are a worship team leader, I've got something for you. There's actually a devotional coming out in a couple weeks that I wrote. It's called We Are All Worship Leaders. It's about this idea of raising your team up, just like I talked about how they're not just like an employee, but they are a team member. And not only that, but they're a worship leader no matter what they do on Sunday. I wrote a devotional. I'm really excited to release it. You can sign up for the launch list down in the description below. When you do that, I'll send you a free devotional that you can lead your worship team in and start this conversation about the fact that we are all worship leaders. I believe that if we raise up that responsibility in our entire worship team and get people thinking in that way, that, hey, if I'm just playing auxiliary percussion, or if I'm playing the the keyboard or whatever on Sunday, I am a worship leader. If we can raise up that understanding, I think it's going to lead to healthier worship teams. So sign up for the launch list down below. It'll be out in a couple weeks. And until I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.